This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington, and we are coming on the air with breaking news from the first criminal trial of a former president in the U.S., that is Donald Trump. We have just learned that the verdict is in. After sitting silently through 22 witnesses over 16 days of testimony, the jurors' verdict, whatever it is, will be unprecedented. Just to remind everybody, Donald Trump is charged with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, all tied to those hush money payments made to adult film star Stormy Daniels. Prosecutors claim that the payments were part of an elaborate scheme to, quote, conceal crimes that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election. Now, what about these felonies? Well, each felony carries a potential sentence of up to 4 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Now, if Donald Trump is convicted, prison time is not certain. That will be up to the judge during the sentencing. Let's go right now to Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa, who has been inside the courthouse today. And Robert, what do we know?
Good to be with you, Nora. It is an unreal scene here outside the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse. You can hear the helicopters above, police officers everywhere bracing for this verdict to be revealed by the jury, which has been deliberating all day. Based on our reporting at CBS News, the jury has zeroed in on documents and testimony about a key 2015 meeting between David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer, and longtime fixer Michael Cohen, who was a crucial witness for the prosecution. The jury is wanting to go over this testimony to figure out, was Trump directly involved in the so-called catch and kill scheme to bury scandalous stories about Trump before the 2016 election. We also know the jury wants to know more about that underlying crime the prosecution has been arguing about for the past 7 weeks, that this wasn't just about so-called hush money payments made to adult film star Stormy Daniels. It was about something bigger, about interfering in the 2016 election by deliberately labeling these payments as legal expenses and withholding information from American voters.
It's a very important point, Robert, as the district attorney in this case said from the very beginning. In his words, this is not a case about money for sex. It's about conspiring to corrupt a presidential election and then lying on business records to cover it up. But the question for those 12 members of the jury was the intent question. And so that's what they have worked out on what we estimate to be about 10 hours of deliberation. Robert, I also understand from our team of reporters that are still inside the courtroom that Trump is sitting with his arms crossed. He's pouting, he's staring at the judge, and it feels tense inside the courtroom. You've watched Donald Trump over these past 6 weeks and have been in close contact with officials close to him. What has been his mood, his demeanor? How would you characterize this moment is?
Nora, I can't underscore the drama of the past 15 minutes. It was just 15, 20 minutes ago that many people inside the courthouse behind me, including our own reporters, members of the Trump team, members of the prosecution, believed the jury would be deliberating till about 4:30 this afternoon and then break and then resume deliberations on Friday. Then a sudden turn. A verdict was made. A verdict was decided. It has not yet been revealed. Everyone called back into the courtroom. Trump was confident all day. We saw him mingling with his staff, talking to family members in the holding room as they waited for the deliberations to be over. He has to be here at the court as the jury deliberates, but he was in an upbeat mood. That has turned. The verdict is now coming, and this is more than just a legal battle for former President Donald Trump. He is the first former president of the United States, any American president, to face a historic criminal trial. And this comes in the middle of a presidential campaign against President Joe Biden, whose campaign has been here in recent days in Lower Manhattan. Everything's on the line right now for Trump, the former president of the United States. Will he serve jail time if there is a guilty verdict? He could get probation, but a prison sentence is possible. And this is someone who just said minutes ago to reporters he wants to campaign. And this has already been a burden, a real political cost for him, costing him time.
Robert Costa, thank you. And we should note that the picture you are looking at right now is a live picture from right outside the courtroom where we have seen Donald Trump appear some days at the end of the trial or before to make statements about what he has called a witch hunt going on inside. Want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. We've been to places in history that we've never been before with Donald Trump, twice impeached. Now is likely to become, or could become, I should say, the first president tried in a criminal trial to either be acquitted and found not guilty or guilty. We just haven't been here before in this. What are the stakes for Donald Trump as he is the Republican Party's nominee?
Right. To pick up on Robert Costa's point, it's not just that he's a former president, Nora. He's the Republican nominee in waiting in an active presidential campaign, shadowed, as he has been for months now, by criminal indictments. We're now going to have probably the only verdict on any of the pending criminal indictments before the election. If he's acquitted, most people I've talked to in the Trump universe believe there will be a burst of energy around the former president in a very positive political way. And if he's convicted, they believe, those in the Trump inner circle, that this will be convulsive for the country. Because at least a third of the country, Nora, and maybe more than a third, believe this entire case should never have been brought in the first place, agree entirely with the former president's orientation to this, that others looked at this and didn't seek to prosecute this, that this is a legal reach to take a business records case, attach it to a felony in a campaign context, which has never been prosecuted before in New York. They agree with that orientation to this. And if he's convicted, those in the Trump inner circle predict a convulsive reaction. However, there will be a part of this country, Nora, that will say if the former president is convicted, there is now finally some institutional accountability for someone who has been toppling, or at least attempting to topple, all sorts of institutional norms in this country. I can't give you an assessment of the actual point by point, number by number political reaction to this, but we are in a fraught moment in American history. A lot of things hang in the balance, not just for former President Trump, but the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, President Biden, and our sense of institutional permanence and norms.
No doubt, and this is day 2 to remind everybody of the jury deliberations. And just a short time ago, we got word from the judge that a verdict was in. Judge Merchan saying the jury has a verdict, but we would like an extra 30 minutes to fill out forms if that is possible. Want to bring in a former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney and CBS News legal contributor, Rebecca Roiphe. She joins us now. And Rebecca, this 30 minutes, of course, everyone is waiting to hear what this jury has decided first. 10 hours over 2 days. The number of questions that they asked to get clarification on. What do you think that tells us about how this jury may be leaning?
You know, it's always impossible to know what a jury has decided until that verdict is actually read. However, this was an incredibly quick deliberation over 2 days. As you said, only about 10 hours of deliberation. It looks like the jury was thinking carefully about the testimony and about the elements that needed to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. But, you know, generally speaking, when verdicts are rendered this quickly, it usually is a sign that is positive for the prosecution, because it normally takes far longer for 12 jurors to agree to acquit than this short amount of time. But of course, really, that is pure speculation at this point.
Let's also bring in Caroline Pelosi. She is the criminal defense attorney and a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. And Caroline, good to talk to you. Just on this matter, falsifying business records in New York, that is a misdemeanor, but can be elevated if, in fact, intent was used to conceal another crime. That's why this case is relevant, because the prosecutors made the case that there was intent, of course, a campaign finance violation. To their words, they said it could have tipped the election. What do you see that the jury has come back so quickly?
That's right. I really do agree with Rebecca. I think the swift nature of this verdict and the fact that we didn't get any other notes from jurors saying we're having trouble coming up with a unanimous verdict, something of that nature. We were bracing ourselves for something along those lines. I agree. This feels like guilty verdicts are on the way. The object crime that you're talking about there is a New York State conspiracy to violate election law, and that is by influencing an election through unlawful means. And we saw that the jurors requested rereads of testimony, David Pecker's testimony regarding that 2015 Trump Tower meeting in which the prosecution alleged this plan, this conspiracy was hatched. So I think that we are seeing sort of the pieces of the puzzle come together for that object crime, making this what was in one case a misdemeanor, now a felony crime, falsification of the records in furtherance of hiding this New York State election law conspiracy.
Any moment now, we could get the verdict in this case against Donald J. Trump, these 34 felony counts. The jury had asked for an additional 30 minutes. That time has passed, so we are on standby to find out what these 7 men and 5 women have decided in this case. There are also, we should note, 2 lawyers who are on this jury as well. Let's bring in Jan Crawford, who is our chief legal correspondent, also covers the Supreme Court. What do you see about today as we await this verdict?
Well, I mean, following up on Major's point, I think what is so extraordinary is this was kind of seen as maybe the weakest of the cases that could have been brought against former President Trump. The main case being, of course, potentially the prosecution for his attempts to overthrow the 2020 election. That case has kind of ground to a halt as it is now before the Supreme Court on whether or not he is absolutely immune from prosecution there. We're awaiting a decision from the court which could determine whether that trial will go forward. It could be potentially impossible for that prosecution. So we could be in a situation where out of all the cases, the classified documents case, the January 6th potential prosecution, in this case, this could end up being the only case against former President Trump to go to trial and potentially merit a conviction. And to Major's point, that could land in ways that we cannot possibly imagine. A former president being convicted on charges that are novel in some cases, considered weak by many legal commentators, and multiple grounds for the president to argue on statutory and constitutional grounds that he is going to appeal this and fight it in the appellate courts.
Donald Trump and his attorneys are in the courtroom. The judge is in the courtroom. The jury is being brought in. We are just minutes or seconds away from a verdict. And of course, as soon as we know that information, we will share it with you. I think one of the key questions likely that our viewers may have, if Donald Trump is a convicted felon, he can still run for president. Does it mean he will go to jail?
We don't know because the judge has discretion. As a matter of fact, in the closing arguments,
but he could.
Yes, he could.
I mean, that's out there on the table.
But in the closing arguments, former President Trump's lead attorney, was harshly criticized by the judge for injecting into his closing argument something that defense attorneys know they shouldn't inject, which is, you can't send a former president to jail over this. And the judge said, wait a minute, you can't talk about that. First of all, it's a discretion in my hands. And second of all, you can't talk to a jury that way in your close. But the former president's legal counsel injected that, I believe, as a safe harbor to tell the jury the stakes are so high. Tactically, I believe the jury knew that going in. The jury has known from day one the stakes are enormously high. One other point, talking about this 2015 meeting in Trump Tower. The prosecution said that's where this began, and it took on incredible relevance in the final weeks of the campaign, which I remember vividly, Nora, because I was covering it day by day, when the status of Donald Trump as the Republican Party nominee was thrown into great distress by the Access Hollywood tape and everything that flowed from that.
I think it's very important that you bring this up because people say, I don't understand why this is relevant. This relationship that they had 18 years ago, why is this coming up now again? Because it was. October was when the Access Hollywood tape came out.
Yes.
Donald Trump's team was worried that this would completely derail his chances in beating Hillary Clinton.
There were
this is
public
the
calls
motivation to squash
and lots
stories
of
about these affairs.
behind-the-scenes conversations about, is there an alternative? Should Mike Pence become the nominee? For the one and only time in that campaign, or his presidency or his post-presidency, Donald Trump publicly apologized. He recorded what was described in gallows humor by Trump aides that time as a hostage video to say, I'm sorry for this locker room talk. That shows the depth of distress within the Trump campaign over that particular time. And the Stormy Daniels story, if it had been confirmed and verified in that real time, the Trump campaign had every reason to believe that could have been not only damaging, Nora, but potentially fatal in the closing hours, closing weeks of that campaign.
We are just moments away from a verdict in the case against Donald Trump. I want to bring in Errol Barnett, who is outside the courtroom. You can see a lot of the activity, though, where Errol is, a lot of the police activity. And Errol, remind us what some of the questions were that the jury had today in terms of clarification.
Nora, that's what's so interesting. It was yesterday, after only approximately 4 hours of deliberating, that the jurors had notes for the judge. They needed instruction from the judge on what it meant to infer something. They also wanted instructions as to how to value Michael Cohen's testimony, considering he was an accomplice to this alleged crime. They also wanted 4 additional pieces of testimony as it related to David Pecker, a close confidant, and someone who testified that he's still a friend of Trump and considers him a mentor. And they had questions about testimony relating to a Trump Tower meeting in August of 2015, which the prosecution says was the nexus, the core, the origins of a scheme to deceive the American public by suppressing negative stories about Donald Trump in the tabloids, amplifying negative stories about his opponents to effectively pave the way for him to the White House. They wanted clarification on that. And what's interesting is when the judge clarified that because Michael Cohen is an accomplice, you cannot convict based on his testimony alone unless it is corroborated by other evidence and testimony as part of the trial. Also, he clarified to them that they can infer something. Basically, he used the analogy of if it rained overnight. Even if you didn't see the rain, you can infer that it rained overnight if you can see outside your window in the morning and people have umbrellas and the pavement is wet. So even in the absence of direct fact, you can make an inference as a jury if other facts seem to suggest and reasonably line up another scenario. And so as we await to hear what the exact verdict is, we are now, I understand, inside the courtroom with jurors seated, with Donald Trump looking quite anxious. We're getting word of what the verdict is.
We are getting word on the first count that Donald Trump is guilty. Now remember, there are 34 counts that we will go through. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Count 5 and 6, guilty. Count 7, guilty. Count 8, guilty. Count 9, guilty. Count 10, guilty. Count 11, guilty. Count 12, guilty. Count 13, guilty. Count 14 and 15, guilty. Count 16, guilty. Remember, this is a unanimous decision by the jury on each of these counts. Count 17, guilty. Count 18, guilty. Count 19, guilty. Count 20, guilty. Count 21, guilty. Count 22, guilty. Count 23, guilty. Count 24, guilty. Count 25, guilty. Count 26, guilty. Count 27, guilty. Count 28, guilty. 29, guilty. Count 30, guilty. Count 31, guilty. Count 32, guilty. Count 33, guilty. Count 34, guilty. Donald Trump has been found guilty on all counts of falsifying business records in an attempt to cover up these alleged relationships in the New York hush money trial. It's an extraordinary moment.
Nora, to hear you read what you just read is a moment of enormous gravity for this country. We cannot overlook that. To hear that word, guilty, not just once, but 34 times about a former president of the United States in any context is completely uncharted territory. And there will be a raging debate across this country about the propriety of bringing these charges. But under our system, a grand jury heard the evidence. A grand jury rendered an indictment. And through all due process, the former president was accorded all due process rights. And a jury of his peers assembled in New York in this courthouse found him guilty on all charges. This is not just a legal moment for this country. It is not just a political moment for this country. It is a moment where everything about politics and law and our orientation to both are convulsed as never before.
Donald Trump has become the first former president ever convicted of a crime. I want to bring in Robert Costa, who has covered Donald Trump for a long time and written books about Donald Trump. I can only imagine what the former president is doing right now.
Nora, this is the conclusion of a trial, but it's only the beginning of a fight. I've already gotten new reporting from Trump sources. They are planning to appeal this decision as much as they can, and they plan to mount a grievance war across the country. To echo what Major said, this is a moment of seriousness for the country on a legal, political, and Democratic front, because you now have a presumptive Republican nominee who will be mounting an appeals process as he heads toward the Republican convention, and he has the Republican Party behind him. It was here in the park, steps away, that the Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, Mike Johnson, came here to say, "We stand with Trump." So many have come here wearing red ties and saying that Trump is our candidate, regardless of whether he's convicted of a crime in New York City. Here in deep blue Manhattan right now, there were cheers that went up in the park around us as the conviction was made clear to the crowd that has been gathering here. But from Trump supporters across the country, there is anger and frustration right now. And Trump campaign officials are arguing this is going to make Trump stronger inside the party. But now, as a convicted felon, it could raise new questions about maybe not his nomination for the Republican Party, but Democratic sources really believe some swing voters in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, in the suburbs across the country might start to say, do we really want to have a convicted felon in the White House? It's a tag that Trump can no longer escape.
It's an important, we're talking about a legal issue right now, but a political issue as well, as you point out. I want to go straight to Errol Barnett, who is right outside, who can give us a sense of what's happening there outside the courtroom. Errol?
Nora, two angles I can give you. Outside the courthouse, we're hearing some sense of cheering and people yelling guilty. The courthouse directly behind me, while our reporters inside are painting some of the color as the foreperson read out the verdict. It was very similar, Nora, to the way you read this out. It was quiet and somber inside the courtroom, with former President Donald Trump seated as the defendant, looking at the jury as the foreperson, leaning with his left arm on a railing and a right hand holding the microphone, slowly 34 times said guilty as the judge was asking for the jury's verdict on these felony counts. Then the judge asks the jury, is this accurate? Is this the proper reflection of your verdict? They said yes. And during this entire time, Donald Trump staring intently at each of the jurors, the lawyers standing with their hands clasped, and the jurors at this moment being thanked by the judge for their service. Judge Merchant acknowledging that these past 6 weeks have been stressful for them. Let's not forget, some jurors that were selected early dropped out and buckled under the pressure, the media spotlight, and the importance of the moment. But inside the courthouse, a somber moment as Donald Trump, former president of the United States, GOP presumptive nominee, had to sit and listen as a defendant as a jury of 12 of his peers found him guilty on all 34 felony counts. This was the moment that Donald Trump became a felon.
Errol Barnett, thank you so much. I want to bring in our legal panel. Again, former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney and CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe joins me again. And Rebecca, let's talk about this. Donald Trump is 78 years old, a first-time offender in the eyes of the New York court system. Will he go to jail? What do you think happens?
We really won't know until the sentencing. I think that, he's certainly not going to jail for the rest of his life on these counts, but there is real possibility of some jail time. And of course, any jail time for somebody in his position of his age is a significant thing right now. You know, one other thing that has struck me about this case is there has been so much criticism of the case. And in a way, this verdict does vindicate Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, who brought this and defended it as a case that is quite standard for New York and for Manhattan. And, you know, of course, when all eyes are on our local justice system, sometimes things look unusual, bizarre, different. But in many ways, this is not as different from other cases as some people suggested it was. And the evidence, as we can tell from this quick, strong verdict, was fairly strong.
Rebecca, thank you. I want to bring in Caroline Pelosi. She's a criminal defense attorney and lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. And on that same point, Caroline, because I think people want to know not only what happens to Donald Trump, what happens in this presidential election, which is now 6 months from now. The question before the judge in terms of sentencing, prison time, or there could be probation, right? What are some of the things that the judge will consider?
Absolutely. It is within the judge's discretion. There is no mandatory minimum jail sentence for these crimes. I totally agree with Rebecca. This is a huge win for Alvin Bragg. This case had a long and winding road to get here. Remember, it was called the zombie theory. It just wouldn't die. It spanned over two different district attorneys. People resigned in protest for the ways that they felt about whether or not the case was being brought. But this will mark the beginning of a lengthy appellate process. I like to point to the Harvey Weinstein verdict being overturned. That took soup to nuts 4 years. Justice takes time. So there are, many legal issues here that I think are ripe for review. I don't know that any will take the day, but certainly there are meritorious arguments to be made. But when you're thinking about potentially putting a presidential candidate in jail, there are some considerations to be had. But I would note he was not, a stellar defendant during this case. Those are aggravating factors. These issues with the gag order, his behavior throughout the trial, that could potentially be a factor in Judge Merchan's analysis of whether or not to impose jail time here. Also, things like remorse. It does not seem as though the former president is at all remorseful for any of these actions. We'll have to wait and see for the arguments that are made in the sentencing memoranda.
It's a good point, Caroline. As you note, Judge Merchan has found Donald Trump that violated his gag order 10 times during this trial. Caroline Pelosi, stand by. I want to bring in former Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance, who first opened this investigation into former President Donald Trump in 2018, but left office before the charges were filed. Cy, good to see you. What's your reaction to today's verdict?
My reaction is a huge congratulations to the assistant DAs and to Alvin Bragg for the amazing job that they've done in trying what was a very difficult case, a complicated case. And I think from an outside perspective, because I wasn't in the courtroom, I think they tried it almost flawlessly. So it was an important case. And I congratulate them in the office. As you said, this case began. The Trump investigation began some time ago when I was district attorney. We had to go to the Supreme Court twice in order to get access to his financial and tax records. That led to, when I was in office, his indictment for the Trump's company's indictment for tax crimes. And then as the case moved on, DA Bragg took it up and has succeeded in doing something very important.
We are watching now, just outside the courtroom, members of Trump's team coming out. Some of his lawyers, as well as his communication specialists. So my guess is they're trying to decide what to do next and whether we'll hear from Donald Trump himself. So I do want to ask you, though, given this verdict, do you see there are grounds for appeal? What could the timeline be?
Well, I think the appeals will happen whether there are grounds for them or not. I think there will be many claims by the Trump team for judicial errors, bias, errors in instruction. I think the appeals will come from all sides, but I think that by no means are those appeals certain to prevail. And at the moment, I think what we're seeing is a sad day in the sense that a former president has been convicted. A day we should celebrate, however, for the victory of the justice system and our jury system and our court system to be able to manage a case this significant and difficult. And I think it will ultimately, I hope, end up having a calming influence. But as I say that, I think really what we'll see next is what is the political reaction and how that the political reaction will be managed over the next months.
And Cy, I want to just listen in here now because Donald Trump is approaching the cameras.
Are you worried about going to jail? This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end and we'll win because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble, but this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
And there you have it. Donald Trump calling this a rigged trial. We're hearing from sources close to him they do plan to appeal. The sentencing, we have learned, is going to be on July 11th at 10 a.m., where the judge has discretion. Each of these counts, my understanding, can carry as much as 4 years of jail time, as well as thousands of dollars in fine. Just want to quickly fact check something that the former president said. Scott McFarlane is with us. Donald Trump has repeated that this was launched by the Biden administration, but we should just clarify that so that people don't think this is something that Joe Biden initiated.
This is a grand jury, and this is a jury of his peers who did the work in this prosecution adjudication. But it's not just Donald Trump, Nora. It's his allies. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, has just released a statement saying Democrats cheered as they convicted the leader of the opposing party. Elise Stefanik, who chairs the House Republican Conference, said this is a Biden administration prosecution. Not only is this not federal, this is a local prosecution, but this is not a Democratic Party process. But that date really jumps out at me, Nora. July 11th for sentencing. That's 4 days before the Republican National Convention.
Wow.
Opens in Milwaukee, swing state. And to Scott's point, and we should not overlook this, Nora, the politics of this will rage from this moment forward. And those who support former President Trump will regard this as a New York matter and a Democratic matter, not an American matter. They will be offended by this, and they will, to the former president's point, try to rally their supporters and other like-minded Republicans and others on November 5th. The former president has a very serious legal problem. He is trying to remedy it through politics. I
want to bring in Robert Costa, who is there outside the courthouse. And Robert, you could hear how angry Donald Trump was in those comments. What are you learning?
Nora, just seconds ago, got off the phone with someone very close to former President Trump, said he was expressing his anger, his fury about this verdict. Even before it was read, he was predicting to associates that he believed that this trial was a disaster and that he was going to fight it all the way through appeal. He was already signaling to some of the top Republicans in the country in the past hour that regardless of what happened, he wanted them to be with him. He believed they would stand with him. And he is really preparing his allies, tell me just now, to fight this all the way and to use this as a political weapon against President Biden. The Justice Department not involved in this case. This is a case in Lower Manhattan. This was a jury comprised of 12 New Yorkers, people who are his peers in his home city of New York. At the same time, you're going to hear former President Trump constantly use this as a refrain that he was targeted by this trial, targeted by this prosecutor, and he is going to use his own channels of communication, whether it's social media, some kind of rally or speeches or other means, to get his message out there without fact-checking and often without the bounds of normal discourse holding him in. But this is American politics today. He has helped to create and really spearheaded this environment we are in now. But I know from people who have been with him in the past hour that he is furious and that this is not just something he's going to leave to the lawyers. He wants to be out front now, and this country is going to see him out front all summer.
Want to bring back in former Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance and give you the opportunity, sir, to respond to those charges that this case was a disgrace and that was rigged and brought by the Biden administration.
Well, certainly the origins of this case, which was when I was district attorney, had nothing to do with the Biden administration. And I don't think anything changed with regard to DA Bragg taking over and developing his separate case out of where the case began with us. I think what you're going to, your panelists have got it completely right. This is now going to go into the streets. It's going to be a matter of politics. I think the president will take this to the Supreme Court, where I think he hopes that it will finally receive the kind of audience he wishes he had in a jury. And that's going to be taking some time. But it's a great day for the DA's office in Manhattan. I'm proud of their work. I'm proud to be associated with the office. And I think this is a controversial case, but tough cases are controversial. And they did a fabulous job under a lot of pressure and under very bright lights in the public.
And Cy, explain that. How does a state case make its way up to the Supreme Court?
Well, the Supreme Court has issued rulings in many state cases. It will go through the state appeals process, and then after the Court of Appeals, assuming the courts of appeal in New York do not overturn the verdict, and former President Trump will take his best shot at each level and take his best hard shots, then they will appeal to the Supreme Court to accept certiorari, which is a fancy word meaning the Supreme Court agrees to hear the case, and that's the straight path, either through the state system or the federal system, where a defendant has the opportunity to at least ask the highest court in the land to consider reviewing the case.
Cy Vance, thank you. I want to bring in Jan Crawford, who covers the Supreme Court for us. Explain that process, but also, I mean, we're talking again, right, as Cy Vance noted, this will go to the streets, but there's still more to do in the courts, and we're still awaiting decisions from the Supreme Court as well on other matters.
Well, sure. The Supreme Court right now has two other cases involving former President Trump, but they're both related to the prosecution of Trump for his efforts, allegedly his efforts, to overturn the 2020 election here in Washington on January 6th, largely, and whether he's absolutely immune from prosecution for those actions. That's what the court's deciding now, and whether that case can even go forward. And if it can he be charged and other January 6 defendants be charged with obstruction? Major legal issues for the former president and, of course, the court to decide between now and the end of June. But right now, those are going to take a back seat because what many people had hoped to see, certainly Democrats had hoped to see, was a conviction of former President Trump, and they got that. So I think whether or not there was going to be a trial or not on the January 6 efforts.
All right. And I understand we've got some new information coming in from Ed O'Keefe, who is at the White House for us. Ed, what are you learning? Are we going to hear from President Biden?
We are not going to hear from President Biden, but we have a written statement from him, Nora. I'll explain why we won't in a moment. In his statement, he says In New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There's still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office: at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. The threat Trump poses to our democracy has never been greater, the president says in his statement from his campaign. He says Trump, quote, is running an increasingly unhinged campaign of revenge and retribution, pledging to be a dictator on day one and calling for our Constitution to be terminated so he can regain and keep power. A second Trump term means chaos, ripping away Americans' freedoms and fomenting political violence, and the American people will reject it this November. The president is at his vacation home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware today, marking the 9th anniversary of the death of his son, Beau. We saw him briefly this morning in Wilmington, Delaware, at a church service with his family, and they stopped by a veterans memorial before he headed to that beach home. He's expected back here tomorrow for a few events for a few hours. His campaign and here at the White House, they have stressed that the president was likely to say something in some form, but not necessarily make a big deal of this. And isn't it telling that both the convicted former president and the sitting president have said the same thing, that ultimately the American people get to make this decision in November? Nora?
Ed O'Keefe at the White House, thank you. Want to go back outside the courthouse now to Robert Costa and Graham Cates, who have been covering this case so closely. Graham, I know you were inside, just made your way out. Give us a sense of what was happening, the mood there, and the demeanor of the individuals.
As the jurors walked in, neither Trump nor the jurors looked at each other, which is different than earlier in the day. Trump had usually stared and kind of studied the jurors. And then as the foreperson read for each count, guilty, 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 Trump stared straight ahead. He appeared emotionless. When he was finally excused from the proceeding, as he just began walking out, he kind of grabbed his son Eric's hand really briefly, and then with as deep of a frown as you've ever seen on Trump's face, walked slowly out of the room with his entourage behind him.
And
his family was there throughout so much of this. Now, Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr. was here, but Eric Trump was also here for the civil fraud trial. For Trump, he ran a family company, all of these payments made through the Trump organization, his family there with him in the courtroom.
Yeah, Eric, more than anyone, throughout this trial and his civil fraud trial, came frequently on many days.
And Robert, I want to ask you, because we have now learned that this sentencing by Judge Merchan will be July 11th. And Donald Trump will be sentenced as a convicted felon 4 days before the Republican convention. Can you run a presidential race just on grievance alone? I mean, how will that change the dynamics, the contours of this race?
It's not going to change the contours of this race too much. I've spent a lot of time talking to officials in the Biden campaign and talking to Trump campaign officials, and they've made it clear to me on the Trump side that grievance is the fuel that helps Trump supporters really get aligned with him, even if they have concerns about his conduct or different policy positions. But Trump's also running a campaign concurrently against President Biden's record on the economy, about border security, railing against the president's policy on immigration. So in many respects, he's running a traditional Republican campaign, and that's why he has the Republican Party ensconced in his grip. He is someone who has the speaker, so many senators saying, "We're with you, Trump," nodding along. They almost forgive his grievance because they believe he's able to put together a coalition of populism, nationalism, and anger that will propel not only him to the White House, but them. And that's really the calculus here for so many Republicans at the highest level I'm speaking with. They're staying with Trump because they believe he still is, even as a convicted felon who might have a prison sentence as he approaches the Republican convention, he still is their path to power.
I think this is a good time to go through some of the basic questions that are out there, because Donald Trump said that the real verdict will be on November 5th. That is now 159 days away. Major, he can run for president as a convicted felon.
Absolutely.
Right. Can he vote?
Yes, because he's not, so he's not adjudicated fully because the appellate process goes on, so it's not over until it's over. And as Cy Vance indicated, that overness may take a considerable period of time because the former president will try to find every venue possible, legal, to reevaluate and possibly overturn this verdict.
And in reading
So until all that is done, he is a voter in good standing, to my understanding.
there are former prosecutors who said that it's unlikely that a 77-year-old former president, since this is his first offense in this course, would be sentenced to jail. But it could happen. But could he be elected president while serving prison time?
Well, obviously that's never happened, right? But there's nothing that we know of that would stop that from happening. And even if he doesn't go to jail, I mean, there's a number of other options available to this judge, including house arrest. So what does that mean for the campaign? I mean, it is almost inconceivable to kind of think about all, the road ahead for us now as this political campaign starts with a convicted felon that's potentially the Republican nominee.
And our polling division and election analysts, Anthony Salvanto, Kabir, others, know how difficult it has been, impossible, Nora, to actually gauge what people's reaction is going to be if there was a conviction. We now are in the first hours of the country absorbing this. And all these questions now overhang a presidential campaign in ways they didn't 1 hour ago. And when people think about this, some will be enraged, some will find solace that there is accountability institutionally in our country and our system works, our justice system works, and others are going to ponder, well, my goodness, what does this mean if he is elected? And those imponderables now are realities. And how people process that and then decide their voting behavior from that is unknown territory, but it begins in earnest this afternoon.
But, he set the ground yesterday for this, saying that Mother Teresa wouldn't have even beaten these charges and the system was rigged. And people will believe that.
Some people will believe that, for sure.
There are a significant number of people will believe that. You look at polling that shows a complete erosion of faith in our institutions across the board. Many people say that Donald Trump caused some of that. But when you hear Republican leaders right now in the House and Senate issuing statements saying this is a travesty, this is a pro-Biden judge, this was rigged from the beginning, a significant number of American people will believe that.
You don't think it's a stretch to compare Donald Trump to Mother Teresa?
Well, I didn't say that. I think he said that.
Yeah.
And there's going to be this process to try to discredit jurors. We've seen that in the previous prosecutions that are aligned to January 6th and the 2020 election, where they say it's a liberal jury in Washington, D.C., a liberal jury in Manhattan, almost like there's
it is a liberal jury in Manhattan. I think that's hard to argue with.
But for the moment the jurors met behind closed doors, you function as a jury. And the foreman had to get up, hold a microphone today, and announce a verdict against a former U.S. president. And there is always this concern. Anybody related with a nexus to a Trump case has the threat of being threatened, doxxed, or hassled.
But, Jan, those jurors also swore that they could be impartial.
Oh,
so just to say
absolutely.
that they're from a liberal area that votes liberally and votes Democratic does not mean that they did not promise under oath that they would be impartial.
And I certainly am not implying that. Yeah. I am saying that we have to acknowledge what the facts are, because those are facts that the American people are going to hear.
To Jan's point, inferences will be drawn.
Yeah.
Inferences in the political dialogue across this country will be drawn about the composition of this jury and the location of this case.
And the
inferences
judge
will be drawn.
And the judge, and why the case wasn't brought initially under the previous district attorney, and why the federal government didn't pursue these federal election charges against Trump. I mean, there's a number of questions that people are going to have. There's a number of questions that Trump is going to raise on appeal, starting from the very beginning with the indictment itself and how some of, what was some of those underlying object offenses. There are constitutional issues that he can raise. There is a lot there that he can use as this campaign unfolds to argue and point to that this entire prosecution was flawed from the get-go.
I think we all have a lot of questions, too, about what happens next, not only in the political arena, but also what happens to Donald Trump. So I do want to bring back in Caroline Polisi. She, Caroline, the judge, as we've noted, has wide discretion over the sentence here. But do you think that Judge Merchan will sentence the former president to prison?
I don't. I personally do not think that, for better or for worse, Trump has been treated like any other criminal defendant. The fact is, based on a reading of a lot of these types of cases, not many are actually sent to serve time. And so if you're treating the former president just like any other regular Manhattanite that would have been sentenced here, as a first-time nonviolent offender, it would be very unlikely that he would go to prison. I think that if he does get sentenced, that would just sort of add fuel to his fire in terms of acting as though he's being singled out here. So not to mention the fact that there would be issues with the Secret Service. He would not be with the general population. It would be a big burden on the prison system to have him there. So personally, I think that the objectives of sentencing can be accomplished through other forms of punishment, fines, probation, that type of thing. So I don't see it happening personally.
What do you think is the more likely sentence?
I think he will get a probationary sentence. I think that there will be fines to be, tied to the offense conduct in this case. Look, the fact is it's not going to have any effect on his run for presidency from a legal perspective. Obviously, there's nothing in the Constitution that, says that he cannot run. On the voting part, he's registered to vote in Florida, and they do sort of concede to the state in which the potential felony has been adjudicated. And in New York State, any felon can vote as long as they're not currently incarcerated serving time. So if he doesn't serve any time, he will definitely be able to vote.
In researching and preparing for today, I did read, though, that if Donald Trump is sentenced to probation, he would be required to clear any out-of-state travel, such as campaign rallies or fundraisers, with a probation officer.
Well, that is absolutely true.
Yeah. I guess that can be done through staff and lawyers, but nevertheless, something we haven't seen before.
Absolutely. And that happens every day. I do that for my clients a lot, all the time. It is not fun dealing with probation, getting every little, detail of your life, really having them sign off on any time you want to travel. I do not see the former president, conceding lightly to this type of probationary sentence, but nonetheless, he will have to.
And then finally, Caroline, on grounds for appeal, what do you think Trump's attorneys could latch onto?
There are a lot of grounds for appeal here, starting with just the law, the statute under which the DA brought this case. There's been a lot said about this issue of unanimity among jurors. While the elements of the offense here were reached unanimously, there is this added little hook here that the object offense here, the New York State election law conspiracy, had to be done through quote unquote unlawful means. The jurors did not have to find unanimously with respect to what those unlawful means were. Remember, there were 3 presented to them: tax fraud, FICA violations, and other falsification of business records. I think there are potential due process issues in that statute. And then with respect to the jury instructions, they weren't allowed to bring them back with them. There will be questions on just how they arrived at their verdict. There is a lot here. I'm not convinced that any will take the day, but I do think that they are not frivolous arguments.
Carolyn, thank you. I just want to share with you what we're hearing from our Pat Milton, a producer out there, is that as soon as the verdict was released, the NYPD dramatically increased their presence there. You may have been able to hear as Robert Costa was speaking, or Errol Barnett, the NYPD helicopters flying overhead of the courthouse. Streets all locked down there. I think you still see the president's motorcade there. That's the shot there. There's some 100 mixed onlookers, protesters, supporters. There are Trump supporters there wearing red MAGA hats. They are gathered. So it is quite the scene in Manhattan there for this historic verdict. Just to remind everyone, just a short time ago, learning that this jury of 12 were unanimous in convicting Donald Trump on all 34 counts. And Donald Trump will be sentenced now on July 11th. That date's significant, certainly, as he will become a convicted felon just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. And Major, I'm wondering what happens now in the next couple of weeks. Donald Trump can now campaign freely, which he has had trouble doing because he has had to appear in court every day.
Right.
So he can travel the country. We don't know what will happen on July 11th, but if he sends to probation, he could still be out there on the campaign trail.
He could still be out on the campaign trail, providing it's approved through all the probationary processes, which is also uncharted terrain. And in the one sense that I think this trial matters politically is that for the former president, every day at the courthouse was a day to prepare for this day. He knew that charges rendered against him could result in a guilty verdict. So how do you prepare for that? You don't prepare for it psychologically, not if you're former President Trump. You prepare for it politically. And seeding the clouds every single day with deep-seated questions about the process and the orientation of the judge, the jury, the proceedings around it, some of it completely without factual basis, some of it driven entirely by grievance, some of it completely ignoring the underlying facts, but some of it based on his own gut sense that if he were convicted, what he had to do in that intervening time, however long this trial took, was prepare his supporters for the idea that if it was a guilty verdict, it would be on its moment deemed fraudulent and offensive to them. That's the political terrain that the former president has occupied every single day of this trial. And it now takes on greater significance because in his rhetoric, what I foretold has now happened, and I will campaign on that basis.
I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe, who is at the White House and has traveled recently with President Biden out on the campaign trail. What are you hearing from Biden's advisors?
Nora, we've just gotten off the phone with White House and campaign officials who tell us we will not see or hear from the president for the remainder of today. He remains at his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, with his family privately marking the death of his son, Beau. Campaign aides stress that the reaction to this, whatever it looks like in the coming days, is expected to be modest because it is their view, based on polling done by us, by other news organizations, by the campaign, that this is not going to move large blocks of voters in battleground states in any real measurable way, that opinions on the former president are pretty much baked in. And to that point, we saw just minutes after this verdict, the former president send an appeal to his supporters to donate to his campaign, calling him a, quote, political prisoner. We saw the current president use his Twitter or X account to blast out a fundraising appeal to his supporters, saying this will all be determined in November. And so both of these campaigns now are preparing for just that. In the case of the Biden campaign, he was in Philadelphia yesterday speaking about the economy, trying to sustain support with black voters, and aides that I was just speaking with remind us the plan is to keep focused on issues like access to abortion rights, corporate greed. You're going into the month of June, so you're dealing with a lot of anniversaries around mass shootings, and that's expected to be part of his focus. And on the world stage, he'll be in France and Italy in the next 2 weeks, meeting with European leaders. There's news this afternoon from here regarding the expansion of the military operations in Ukraine. Just be presidential and allow that contrast to stand alongside what we're seeing on the streets of New York and continue to play out. I'm being handed a statement from the White House counsel's office, and this will stand, Nora, as the only official comment from the White House today. Spokesman for the White House counsel's office saying, quote, "We respect the rule of law and have no additional comment." Nora?
Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much. I want to bring back in Cy Vance as we watch the president's motorcade leave the courthouse there. And Cy, thank you again for staying with us, and it's great to have your expertise as the former Manhattan District Attorney. So Trump would likely have to visit this probation office. Is that now? What is that like?
Well, he, like every other defendant, is going to be interviewed by the probation department because the probation department makes a recommendation to the judge regarding sentence as a state organizational matter. I don't know whether that he was checking that box out while he was still in court. More likely, he was staying there because of the security issues that they wanted to have locked down between courthouse and his Trump residence.
Yeah, and Cy, Major Garrett has a question for you.
Cy, so good to have you with us.
Yeah,
could you, from your perspective, answer or inform parts of the country that hear former President Trump say this case never should have been brought? There is no crime. It is so novel as to stretch all understood bounds of prosecution, even in Manhattan. Those are, I think, the core accusations meant to undermine what we're seeing playing out today. Can you address those?
Well, first of all, you've got to go through a process before you charge anyone, let alone a president, of presenting a case to a grand jury. Those grand jury minutes are reviewed by a judge. The judge goes through innumerable layers of motions to dismiss. I reject the claim that Judge Merchan is biased. Obviously, the former president would disagree with that, but I think he is a very middle-of-the-road, smart, disciplined jurist, and I think he deserves huge credit for managing a very, very difficult case and a very difficult client. So it's easy to blame New York. It's easy to blame the Manhattan DA's office. We were the first office to indict his alter ego company and pursue investigations against him. But that's because it's because of what he did, not because of politics.
Cy, let me ask you, you know Judge Merchan, certainly within the legal system. Do you think he will sentence Donald Trump to prison?
I doubt it. I doubt it. And but giving what Judge Merchan wide room to not telling him anything about what to do. I think that if this were an more ordinary case, given that Alan Weisselberg was sent to 3 months in prison and then another 3 months for lying, that his boss, Donald Trump, in any other world would probably be getting an equivalent sentence. A sentence of jail is not required for an e-felony, which is what he's been convicted of now. And your other panelists have said there are lots of options, from home arrest to checking in with the probation before leaving the state. There are lots of ways that they can try to control the president's behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I heard what you said, Cy, that you doubt that Judge Merchan would sentence Donald Trump to prison time. But if he did sentence him to prison time, do you think he would grant bond on his appeal while he makes the appeal?
I honestly don't see a world in which Donald Trump is sentenced to jail.
Yeah, I think that's an important clarification. Yeah, an important, and I appreciate that, Cy Vance. I want to just bring in Katrina Kaufman. She is also there outside the courthouse. And Katrina, I know you were inside. You saw Donald Trump up close. Share with us your reporting.
I was sitting right there as Donald Trump exited the courtroom after this verdict, a very deep frown on his face, followed by his attorney, Todd Blanche, who looked equally upset, and his son, Eric. And as the jury had come into the room before to deliver the verdict, Trump was looking towards them, and none of them looked him in the eye as they walked by. And also, when each one was confirming that they agreed with this verdict that the foreman had read, he looked over at each juror one by one as they affirmed the verdict. His son, Eric, was sitting behind him that whole time, and when they got up, he and Eric had a little bit of a handshake before they exited the room. But I can't describe to you the feeling of tension as well as we waited for the verdict to come down. We got about a 20-minute warning from when the jury sent a note to the judge, and we found out. We were all just sitting there, and you really could have just cut through that tension with a knife. But clearly this was a very difficult moment for him. I was watching him as well as the verdict came down, and he just had this very blank look on his face. His eyes were so squinted that it was almost hard to tell if they were even open during part of the time that the foreman was reading that he was guilty on each of these 34 charges.
Katrina, Thank you. And just to recap what we have learned in the last hour, this historic decision, Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts. This is the first time in history that this has happened with a former president. He is also the Republican nominee for president and will be sentenced 4 days before the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee this July, and just after a presidential debate as well, the first this summer against Joe Biden, which will be must-see TV, no less. I want to ask about that because I think many people look at sometimes, I just want to step back for a second. When we show national polls or you read about national polls about the mood of the country, those are the mood of the national electorate. But a presidential race is decided in battleground states. Sure. And it will be decided in 7 key battleground states, just like it was in the last election. And of those 7 battleground states, that's what we'll be looking at closely too, is does this sway that small percentage or two of voters either way? Does it bring some of Trump's supporters who've been on the fence and say, you know what, this was rigged. I'm really angry. I want to change the country. And they decide to come back. Or do some of those independents in these key 7 battleground states say, you know what, I kind of liked Trump. I like some of the things he did on the economy or on immigration, but this just can't go on. I will cast my vote for Joe Biden or I'll stay home. I mean, that's the question that confronts us now in terms of the political arena, correct?
Exactly. And there's polling data in, let's just say, 3 of those battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that show anywhere from 10 to 15% believe if there's a guilty verdict, it might influence how they approach their vote. Well, that's not a sizable total in the 100% context, but in states like Wisconsin, decided by 20,000, Michigan decided by 180,000, Pennsylvania decided in 2020 by 80,000. Suddenly that number, that percentage of people whose votes actually they thought beforehand could be influenced and possibly negatively about Trump if he's found guilty. Well, suddenly that becomes very, very important for the former president and for President Biden. But I would say this about that polling data. It's instructive, Nora, but it is not reliable because until this moment happens, until this history lands before all of us, we don't know what our attitude is going to be. Now we're beginning that process.
I'm interested what happens to the polls after this remarkable 3 or 4 weeks we're about to experience in America, where there's a presidential debate between 2 men who've had the job before, a president of the United States now out of office being sentenced for a felony, and then a Republican National Convention. And somewhere in between, we also could find out what the Supreme Court is going to let happen here in Washington on the 2020 election conspiracy case.
And whether that trial will go forward.
Whether it even goes forward. All of that happening in this finite period of time.
And Jan, you cover the court so closely. What do you think happens with the Supreme Court? That they will say that he's not completely immune from prosecution?
Because Donald Trump is saying he's absolutely immune from prosecution in the January 6th stuff. They're not going to go along with that. But the appeals court kind of said, well, no, Donald Trump, you can be prosecuted for pretty much anything. I think they're going to find some middle ground where there's some immunity. What is it? And what does that mean? That means that we're going to get a decision potentially at the end of June. Is the court going to send it back to a lower court? And then is that going to further delay this trial?
But practically speaking, what does that mean? So if there is some limited immunity, that would be things that he did while he was president of the United States. So would that cover then these classified documents or January 6th? Those trials could then go forward.
Yes, potentially, absolutely. I do not see the Supreme Court in this case shutting off those federal trials. They may limit some of the charges, but they're not going to say Donald Trump cannot be prosecuted in federal court. But
that will again convulse the nation, don't you think?
No, I don't. I think, yes, it'll be a big headline and it's going to be a big story, but this is the earthquake. This is the trial. This is the conviction that Donald Trump's opponents wanted and they got. There's going to be tremendous validation. Many people believe the system worked as it intended. I think the big headline that we just heard a few moments ago, though, was from Alvin Bragg's predecessor. When you asked him, is Donald Trump going to jail? I mean, he's facing multiple years in prison as a result of this conviction. And he said he can't see a scenario that he would go to jail for this. So now we have a situation where he's been convicted of falsifying business records with intent to cover up a crime that voters really wouldn't have cared about in 2016. And are people actually going to care? And is that going to affect those polls?
Well, it's an excellent question. And fortunately, we have Nicole Killian, who is out on the campaign trail. She's in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. She's been talking to voters. And Nicole, I'm dying to know what you've been learning as you have been out there speaking with people.
Yeah, well, Nora, unsurprisingly, some of the reaction has largely fallen on party lines. As you mentioned, this is a critical battleground state, but this area of Allentown in the Lehigh Valley is really a bellwether for the state of Pennsylvania. So we did talk to some Democratic voters, some Republican voters. Of course, many Democrats tell us that they believe the former president should have been convicted, but many Republican voters that we talked to feel that the system is broken, that this was just a political trial and a political decision. That being said, one Republican voter I spoke to in particular is still wavering to a certain extent in terms of his vote. This is somebody who supported the former president back in 2016 and 2020, but is not sure whether he will support the former president going forward. Nora?
That is really interesting, Nicole. Thank you so much for your reporting there. It has been a historic day here in America. The first ever criminal trial of a president ends in conviction. Former President Donald J. Trump convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree related to those hush money payments. Each of the 34 felony counts is punishable by up to 4 years in prison. But it is up to the judge to sentence Trump to jail, prison, home confinement, probation, or a fine. And we will learn the former president's sentence on July 11th. That is just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. The former president is a convicted felon, but that does not prevent him from running for office for another term in the White House. And it is important also to note that he can't pardon himself if he does become president again, because this is a state crime. Once again, the breaking news: former President Donald Trump has been found guilty by a jury of 12, unanimous, on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7 local news, and tonight we'll have a full wrap-up on the CBS Evening News. Thank you to everyone that joined us. This has been a CBS News special report.